I have a few questions that I want to ask you, but before I get to the more concrete questions, I just wanted to ask you about your overall assessment of the US-Israeli war on Iran. How do you make sense of it? What are some of the issues or maybe patterns that you're kind of tracing or paying attention to these days?
So thanks for having me, first of all, and thanks for organizing this series of, conversation with scholars against war in Iran. It's extremely important at this moment because I do think that this current war is part of the larger pattern. So it's very important that we have our anti-war voice out there. So I think the larger pattern is a pattern where we see regimes of war enlarging and becoming more and more relevant to the foreign policy of every state in the world, but also more and more relevant to our own everyday life. So I really understand this current war as, a continuation of what we have seen in Gaza. In fact, people talk about the Gaza playbook when it comes to the way in which infrastructures for civilian life, infrastructures that enable civilian life and the survival of, societies are being attacked. But also let's think of what's happening in Lebanon is no way, that different. So I really think that the current war on Iran is part of this script, let's put it this way. Which is a script where we see, war becoming as a way of governing societies becoming more and more relevant to the way in which the economy is being conducted. The development of technology, the development of new weapons, the development of, manufacture, industry, becoming something really core to an economy that is, oriented to war. But I also see with a lot of preoccupation the, disappearance of boundaries between, for instance, activities that used to be military and activities that used to be civilian. So as a scholar, I'm particularly preoccupied when it comes to the blurring of research that is, that is oriented towards the production of military and enablement of military activities and civilian research. So research which has no, civilian application, military application. So I really see this war a part of a larger pattern of militarization of societies, militarization of education, militarization of economy, and largely speaking of our everyday life. And the last thing I want to add about this is that war is not exclusively something that, kind of the nation states, sovereign states, do on each other. War is also something that enables societies, that in a way enables the political imagination of society. So what we see with the militarization of international relations and the militarization of the relations between nation states is also a militarization of the relations between state and society.
I want to ask you about one of your own works, because you mentioned this connection, for example, between what's happening in Iran and what was happening in Gaza or in Lebanon, the regional connections, the global connections of these war regimes, knowledge production, the military-industrial complex. But with the Iranian case, one aspect of it is that there's a prelude to it. There's all the discursive production that came before this war, which kind of goes back to that question of knowledge production. You had this in our conversation before the sort of interview. I mentioned that I came across one of your articles that you wrote with Mehdad Emami. The title is "Liberating the Women of Iran: The Regime Change Industry, Women's Rights, and Imperial Wars." And I was reading this the other day, and I found it very relevant. I think you published this after the June war, after the June 2025 war. but I also found it extremely relevant to the current moment and generally to the post-woman life freedom situation that we have found ourselves in. Can you talk about that article a little bit? What was the main argument in that article and how that, the analysis that you developed in that article can help us make sense of the current situation?
Sure, and thanks for mentioning this article, which we published after the so-called June War of 2025. So we were interested in reflecting a little bit around something that we called regime change industry. As you mentioned, there's a long history of knowledge production, public discourse, the so-called gray literature that think tanks and and research centers have put out there, basically emphasizing emphasizing the need for a regime change kind of policy, foreign policy towards Iran by on the part of the U.S. And we have, we really thought about this as an industry. So when you think about it as an industry, you do have resources that needs to be poured into this industry. So part of it is knowledge production, as we just said, but there's also the military side of it. So, more money, talking about the militarization of societies and states, right? So more money goes into, technology, goes into, anything that can strengthen that side of things. But there's also a part that needs to go into the way in which to justify, right? You justify this need for a regime change. And reflecting around this, we have been focusing in particular on this idea of liberating women. So this idea that, we talk about bombs for freedom in the case of this latest war, but, we could talk about bombs for women's rights, in the case of, when we see the cooptation, the instrumentalisation of women's, fight for dignity and bodily autonomy and rights being co-opted by foreign policy. So we have been, and of course this is not new. Like we have seen this, this discourse in the case of Afghanistan, for instance, quite prominently. But what we have been trying to understand is how even, not only this discourse is mobilized, but also there are women that are being co-opted into this industry. And we have been looking at some specific individuals to try to see what kind of, language they were mobilizing, what kind of ideas they were mobilizing. And I think that, what we kind of ended up arguing is that the kind of catch-22 of this situation is that this regime change industry has no accountability or, has just one accountability because it's only accountable to the kind of imperial power that, creates it, the kind of imperial power that pays for it, while it is definitely not accountable to what actually Iranian women, would like to see, and the kind of, politics that they have expressed through, for instance, the woman life freedom upheaval and uprising. So we have been trying to kind of emphasize how this idea of regime change, the instrumentalization of women's fight and struggle for dignity, and imperial power are being, are part of, are linked, first of all, are connected, and are part of, in a way, a larger imperial warfare. And that is really also what personally I'm thinking about these days, witnessing the current war.
I do recommend anyone who's watching this conversation to go and look at Paula's article. And as you said, this is not new, right? Like the case of Afghanistan, obviously, for at least for me and my generation, you might be younger than me, but at least for me and my generation, that was very informative. And the way that the issue of Afghan women was instrumentalized. And of course, we have Leila Abu Lughud's analysis of it and the way that she understood it and helped us understand it. And going back, I mean, Leila Ahmed's work on colonial feminism in Egypt, or the colonial feminist discourse in India or in other contexts too. They're very important frames of reference. And what's important, and I think also relevant to the current moment, is that in all of these cases, in Afghanistan, in Egypt, in India, you also have the native informants who are participating. These are not purely Western manufactured discourses. You have native informants who are participating in the construction of these discourses. And so, another thing that I wanted to bring up with you was this, the rise of this right-wing, pro-war, pro-Pahlavi, pro-Zionist voice in Iranian diaspora. Not to say that it doesn't exist inside Iran, but at least for those of us who are outside Iran and observing it, it's been an interesting sort of phenomenon to see. How do you think of this?
Yeah, so I'm speaking to you from Rome. So we have had, Italy is a rather peripheral place. We do have an Iranian diaspora, quite an old one, but it's of course it's much tinier than than what you have in Canada or the US. But
Probably bigger than what we have in South Korea, though.
that's for sure, 100%. So it's somewhere, in
Yeah.
between all these places. Um, but yeah, so we have seen the same thing happening in Italy as well, which is a very new phenomenon. I mean, of course, there has always been, part of the Iranian diaspora that was monarchist. Like the very reason why a lot of people left after the revolution was precisely this. But the kind of size that we are seeing these days is something new. That's for sure. And I think it goes back to what we were discussing before in terms of woman life freedom and how woman life freedom, although it was, this incredible, feminist with a very strong feminist tone, moment and upheaval and uprisings, it also, had contradictions, and as any kind of big popular movement has. And what we have seen in particular after Woman Life Freedom, and Haaretz wrote about this, Citizen Lab wrote about this, Al Jazeera as well wrote about this. So what we have seen after Woman Life Freedom has been the explicit support, financial support as well, coming from different, foundations, even state apparatuses. Haaretz, for instance, has written about the role of the information minister of Israel, supporting specific parts of the Iranian diaspora and foundation and organization that are monarchist. So I think that Woman Life Freedom also, on the one side, made everybody afraid that actually Iran could turn into, it was such a progressive and also anti-racist. If we think of the importance of the very central slogan of this upheaval coming from the Kurdish liberation movement, it is quite significant and important. So I think that everybody kind of got a little bit afraid that Iran could turn into this, into this very progressive, very feminist, democratic, anti-authoritarian, and anti-racist people and population, so that the reaction against this, so the reaction that meant supporting, regressive, conservative, pro-Zionist, pro-monarchist as well, portion of the diaspora was very important. So I think that, the way in which the importance of monarchist and Zionist and conservative portion of the diaspora, its importance that we see this day, to understand it, we have to go back to the fracture that Woman Life Freedom operated within, especially within the diaspora, and especially in this kind of reactive, if you want, sense. So the way in which it works in Italy is that they have been, newly significant. 6 years ago, this was not the case. We didn't have, monarchist flags. We didn't have Israeli flags accompanying monarchist flags, which we have today. And what is interesting is to see how the right wing political parties in Italy have been instrumentalizing, these monarchist groups within the diaspora. And I'm really, there's part of me that knows that a lot of and we know that. I know that because I've been told that, because I've been, some of the people that have become today monarchists, I used to know them and they were not monarchists. So I'm aware of the fact that a lot of this success of monarchist ideas is connected to the deep desperation of Iranians, right? To the idea that, we are so desperate. There's nothing that works. We tried woman life freedom, we tried reform, we tried everything, So this is another option, and maybe it will work in the current juncture. So I'm very well aware that this is happening, but there's also part of me that is really, really angry at Italian in particular right-wing parties that are preying upon this desperation, that are very much instrumentalizing for their own political goals, for their own visibility, the desperation of these Iranians who are here and probably feel like they have run out of other options. So it's particularly unfortunate, I have to say, and it makes me very, very angry to see this happening and unfolding in front of our eyes, and very few people understand this, because of course the kind of common understanding is like, oh, Iranians are pro-war, oh, Iranians are pro-Trump, but there's very few people who kind of are able to read the background, and this is why I think that these kind of initiatives that you are bringing to the fore are so important, because hopefully they will give more instruments to understand what's going on.
And just briefly, and that's only because Instagram only gives us, I think, 20 minutes to post videos. So just quickly, if since you mentioned the Italian scene and the Italian right and the way that the Italian right has been engaging with all of this, what about the Italian left and generally the European left? I mean, being in Europe, you probably have a much better understanding than many other people. How has the left been responding to all of this?
So, luckily enough, we have progressive forces being organized. So we do have collective progressive Iranians, that have formed in Italy, and not only in Italy, of course. So that's very important and very relieving. There's a lot of talk about campism. There's a lot of talks about, the European left not being able to, to see this double pole of oppression that, that Iranians have to navigate and kind of are faced with, which I think is true, but especially when it comes to my work, and when I think about my role in all of this in this historical juncture, I think that what I try always to emphasize is that we have a common problem, and that's called fascism. We have an Iranian diaspora where there's a lot of fascism in the form of, pro-monarchist Zionism being present. We have the same problem in our countries. Speaking from Italy, our countries are being hegemonized and are being dominated by different forms of fascism or neo-fascism. So what I try to always emphasize is that we have a lot of common ground that we can exploit to kind of, build upon and move on together.
Okay, that's a great hopeful note, I think, to end the conversation. Thank you so much, Paola. I hope that we have a chance to have a more in-depth conversation later.
Thank you very much.